Hey, IFMers. Those of you who are new, this is your first meeting. I can assure you, you're with the most remarkable group of humans that you would ever want to spend 3 days with. This organization, as David Jones and I were just discussing at lunch, if it does no other than one thing, it will put a virus in your central nervous system that you can never escape from. So I would suggest that if you're worried about that infection, you better leave now, because if you don't, you will be forever captured. There is a revolution afoot that we are all participants in. I never thought I would be so fortunate, A, to have my son stand up here and get the crowd control, but B, to be still professionally active at a time where this revolution was at a tipping point. So in 1978, I authored a book called Medical Applications of Clinical Nutrition. Patrick Hanaway was a medical student at the time. He said, Jeff, that was one of the first books that really interested me in this field. And in that book, I proposed that there was going to be this remarkable transition occurring through the development of multi-analyte testing that would allow us to early understand physiological disturbance at such a place that we could intervene early by using less invasive and less toxic interventions to modulate metabolic disturbance and create long-term wellness. That was the theme of the book, 1978. Now, with that as a context, let me ask you a question. How do you know when you are involved in a revolution? Because, you know, we still wake up in the morning, we put our pants on one leg at a time, and gee whiz, you know, how do we know we're really living in a time that epically will be seen by historians to be that of a great transformation? Well, let me then ask you the following, and this might help to bridge the gap into this revolution. So let me ask you, who's the chairman of Apple? Who is the chairman of Apple Computer? Arthur Levinson, right? And who is Arthur Levinson? Arthur Levinson was a biochemist, University of Washington graduate, early 70s, went on to Princeton to get a Ph.D. in biochemistry, did a postdoc at the University of California, San Francisco with Herb Boyer. Most of you know Herb Boyer. He was the founder of the first genetic-based pharmaceutical company, Genentech, of which then Arthur became the CEO eventually. He left then, ultimately, to be on the Google board. He's now the chairman of the Apple board, and he was recently funded as the CEO of a new company, which is Calico Biosystems, that is collaborating with the Broad Institute, which is a joint collaboration between Harvard and MIT to focus on health and wellness technologies to leverage genomics. And he is a fundamental, and by the way, a major funder of that Calico was Google. He sits on the chairmanship of the board of Apple. These are information technology companies, right? Now let me just ask a couple of other questions. Who is Elizabeth Holmes? Right? You all probably know Elizabeth Holmes, at least her reputation. So Theranos, right? She's the youngest billionaire female in the history of American commerce. The company has got a net worth now of about $8 billion. It's a blood spot development 20-analyte technology company that Walgreens has picked up to distribute direct-to-consumer health from a single spot of blood, complete multi-analyte profiling, right? Now the FDA has wanted to oppose this. They don't want information going direct to consumers about health information, but I can tell you the tsunami is overcoming all of these regulatory agencies. We are witnessing a transformation. So let me give you a third question. Who is Jessica Richmond, right? Another interesting woman of authority in our period of time. So you probably know she is another one of these Stanford literati, that she basically graduated in a non-science field directly, but became kind of affiliated, and is now the CEO and co-founder of the company uBiome. And what is uBiome doing? direct-to-consumer microbiome testing. And it's growing very, very rapidly. It's one of these Fortune, companies that's on a rapid ascension. So who is Anne Wojcicki? Why? We know 23andMe. We know the association it had, at least through her former husband, or her husband, which is that of the Google 23andMe connection. The largest database of human genetic information ever been assembled, right? And now it's being sold out to all sorts of people in an anonymous, patient anonymous way to start looking at gene markers and in the interrelationship between health and disease patterns. And then there's a fantastic photograph on the internet that you can all download. It's a lunch meeting with President Obama in the middle at Woodside, California, in the Silicon Valley. It has Larry Ellison, Sergey Brin, the CEO of Cisco. It has the CEO of Apple, the CEO of Facebook, and the CEO of Microsoft all sitting at the table. Together, their net worth is $1 trillion. And what is it that this group of individuals are talking about? The development of informatic and genomic-based healthcare discovery and innovation that will drive the new personalization of healthcare, for which then President Obama went to the microphone in the Rose Garden to do the President's address to the State of the Union, talking about precision medicine. Now you'll notice that in all of these examples I've just shared with you, there's not a single person that represents hospitals, insurance companies, professional AMA organizations, or any other of the conspiratati that has held in check the development of information. So then you start to say, well, what about Jamie Haywood? There's another, that's James Haywood, a man. So this is an MIT mechanical engineer graduate whose brother gets ALS, and he and his other brother then form a group called Patients Like Me, which has grown up to be one of the largest forces for consumer-based or health consumer-based research, virtual research off the internet. They're accumulating data now that is going to be actually changing the whole nature of how we do clinical research in a virtual, patient-oriented fashion. And now, as I go to FDA meetings in discussion about clinical design, the FDA is requiring new clinical trials to get patient input as it relates to outcome variables as it pertains to studies. This is a remarkable transforming period. Larry Schmarr, who you probably know, was with Mark Andreessen forming Netscape, which was the first search engine for the internet. You might recall, those of you back then. So Larry Schmarr, who is an aerospace engineer, worked for NASA, is now at the University of California, San Diego, is traveling all around. You'll see him on all the YouTube downloads, talking about his N of 1 experience in which he's analyzing every possible biometric, genomic, omic metric on himself and looking at how this information can encode not disease, but wellness over time. And then lastly on my list, of course, would be Eric Topol. And his most recent book, The Patient Will See You Now, is a manifesto of change, right? It's a manifesto for change. If you haven't read it, it has to be on your required reading list. So with that as an introduction, why is the functional medicine omics a match made in heaven? Well, I'm going to give you a personal experience, and Lori's giving me, and the IFM people are giving me the privilege of kind of talking very personally. So I'm going to share Jeff Bland's walk down this path and some of my own data. So I owe a lot to Lee Hood, and you're going to hear Nathan Price, Dr. Price, who is a leader of the group, the Institute for Systems Biology in Seattle, Washington. Lee is credited as being the pioneer who was principally involved in inventing a number of the instruments that were used in deciphering the human genome. And he has this Pioneer 100 project that I was one of the 100. I think there was like 105 participants. We just finished our year in 2014, and I'm going to share with you what I learned about myself over this year experience. Because I learned omics in a very intimate level, not theoretic, which I had a pretty good understanding of, but very personal. And this comes from a guy who's been measuring his blood chemistries quarterly for the last 20 years. So what more could I have learned? Well, there was a lot I learned. Because this genomics, metabolomics, microbiomics, epigenomics, transcriptomics, proteomics and exposomics all fits together in some very personal way to direct us not just towards disease risk, but towards wellness. And in fact, there's a wonderful quote that appeared recently in New York Times Magazine talking about the genomic revolution. It said, "It is our genomic origami, this double-stranded helix. In every cell, you have the same piece of paper. How you fold the paper determines if the paper becomes either an airplane or a duck. It's the shape that you fold it in that matters. This has to do with the 3D code of biology. And what is it that shapes the DNA so that it will become the origami of health? It is your environment. It is the epigenetic modulators of experience that occurred the moment the sperm met the egg and have been communicating through this intimate relationship with the most precious thing we own, which is our book of life." So where did it start for me? It started with my mother, who was always a very strong advocate. Now, my mother's story here is important, I think, because as you know, we all inherit DNA, both from our father and our mother, but we get a little extra DNA from our mother, don't we, in our mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's the energy center of the cell. If you knew my mother, you would say, you know where Jeff Bland comes from. She's a vigilant 90-year-old ombudsman for her senior citizens. And what I've learned over the terms of her life has been very useful, I think, as the lens in which I sieve my own experience. So we've moved from Gregor Mendel, this kind of concept of a deterministic genome, dominant, recessive, can't do anything about it, didn't fill out an application card, just got the luck of the draw, to this Watson and Crick model, which is really a model that more relates to genetic plasticity, which I'm going to be describing. That the genes are fixed, but the way they're expressed, as you learned this morning, are multiple based on the environment. And this goes way back to the dawn of the age of the genetic metabolism diseases of infancy with Sir Archibald Garrod, who was born into the family, whose father was a physician, actually was the royal physician to the King of England. And so they had dinner parties with people like Darwin and others that probably influenced his thinking at the dinner table. But he was the father of the genetic metabolism disease concept. And he said, this is in a Lancet article in 1902, it might be claimed that what used to be spoken of as a diathesis of a disease is nothing else but chemical individuality. It is nearly true to say that factors which confer upon us predisposition and immunity to disease are inherent in our chemical structure and even in the molecular groupings that went into the chromosomes from which we sprang. This is 51 years pre-Watson and Crick. So we have a functional medicine legacy. That's where this marriage between omics and functional medicine starts. It starts with Archibald Garrod. It goes up through Roger Williams and Linus Pauling. This is a photograph that was taken in 1974 at the formation of the American Society of Preventive Medicine meeting that I attended, to Bruce Ames, who, as you know, is one of our Linus Pauling Award winners and certainly a thought leader for our field, in which he was quoted as saying, when I interviewed him on Functional Medicine Update, he was 84 years of age at the time, he said, "My enthusiasm genes are undamaged, but I won't vouch for my neurons." You know, so certain things age and others stay constant. So the Human Genome Project was going to be the revolution from which all the pharmaceutical companies would know about the new drugs they were going to be developing, because we'd find all these genes that were tied to specific diseases. And yet the hype was a little overblown. In fact, it led to disillusionment, because we recognized, yes, the code was cracked, but actually the interconnection and the penetrance into the phenotype of that genetic information was not so clear. And in fact, when we do GWAS studies, the genome-wide area association studies, we find that although you get statistical significances of like 10 to the minus 13th between a gene and a disease, that in the terms of an individual patient having that disease with that gene, it's a very low penetrance of frequency. So statistically, it sounds interesting. In terms of clinical application, it's very still esoteric. So why did it lead to disillusionment? It led to disillusionment because single nucleotide polymorphisms are not the whole story. You have these insertions, deletions, copy number variants, mosaicism. The exome represents, as we learned already earlier today, only about 1.5% to 2% of the whole genome. We used to call that other stuff junk DNA, but it's probably not so junky. There's a lot of information there that controls the executive centers of how genes are expressed. And we recognize that cell specificity differs in the way genes are expressed in over 200 different cell types. We know epigenetics then modulates how genes are expressed by methylation, the stop codons on the front end of the gene sequence. We know acetylation alters then the way the genes, the histones open up the genome so they can be read. We know phosphorylation, which is another epigenetic process, modulates kinase signaling systems. We know these small inhibitory RNAs are now starting to be recognized as having a huge role to play in modulating the expression of genes. And then we know oxidation, glycation, and amino acid conjugation also play roles in post-translational modification of proteins and changing our phenotype. Every one of those factors I just mentioned are modifiable based on the environment that the person lives in, how they live, act, think, feel, drink, breathe, and move. So epigenetics is certainly a major part of this emerging story, and if you've read the most recent studies on epigenetics, you recognize that the more we look at the topic, the more we recognize this is a very big wild card in how our genes ultimately give rise to health or disease. Randy Journal, another Linus Pauling Award winner from functional medicine, was, I think, the father of nutritional epigenomics. Musha Sev, who will be speaking at a meeting that we're sponsoring in October at McGill, is another person who has a tremendous background in behavioral epigenetics, how our attitudes, thoughts, and the environment, and stress, and feeling at risk, and feeling being under violence can influence the genetic messages and how they are being expressed. So what we've learned is genes plus environment equals phenotype. And this omics systems biology approach is not just one layer, it's a series of layers that are laid on top of one another as a hologram. And we then, as a clinician, look into the hologram and try to make sense of these different layers that layer on top of one another to give rise to the expression of the phenotype of the individual. So Michael Snyder at Stanford has been highly popularized and studied. He is the first guy to really have his full kind of omics personality tied to his phenomics. And it turned out that as he was having all these studies done as the head of the genetics department at Stanford, he got a viral infection, in fact 2 during the year in which the study was done, and he developed diabetes in the phase of the second infection. And all of that was marked by his genomic and phenomic and omic profiling to actually look at what these patterns were that give rise to a system effect, not a single entity, but a system that shifts in the tide of experience. And then we ask the question, is all of this about disease risk? And here's where I want to take a moment to really give a high degree of affirmation to functional medicine. Because functional medicine is not just a drive to reduce the risk of disease, it's a drive to improve the presence of the function we call wellness. That's a very different game, right, than just reducing the series of risk. All of what we've heard today is about disease risk, genes that tie to risk. But yet there are the genes that tie to resilience. In fact, for most of us, the genes that tie to resilience dominate the disease-related risk genes. They silence the disease risk genes. And Eric Schott and Stephen Friend, in their Resilience Project, are really studying now what characteristics lead to people who have disease risk genes that are highly penetrant that never get expressed into the phenotype because their resilience genes swamp them out. And how do you then optimize the function of your resilience genes? It's a whole different theme than just looking for disease risks. So the 3 reasons why genomics hasn't been widely adopted are chronic diseases are complex and polygenic, with only about 10% explained by common genetic variants. Not sure if the genetic information leads to actionable outcomes, because if that information doesn't help a person to do something, it's just a bad news bear. You really don't want to know it. And lastly, genomic susceptibility data is presently population-based and difficult to apply to the individual. We need an N-of-1 systems approach. Ba-bam! There is the marriage of functional medicine to omics. It is the system architecture that allows a clinician to understand how to apply this information in a systems biology approach to the individual patient. That is what is needed, is a system of connection, a implementable, actionable system. So this study that I was fortunate to be involved in at the Institute for Systems Biology, Dr. Hood's P4 medicine approach, predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory, where you get this intersection between systems biology and systems medicine with consumer-driven healthcare and social networks and digital revolution that we call the big data revolution, all those coinciding and converging, gave rise then to an ability to apply in my life the systems biology approach of functional medicine. And what did I find? What I found was that when we started to assemble this data with the participants in the Pioneer 100 Wellness Project, Pioneer 100 because there were 100 Pioneer first first of principle participants, looked at our life from an examined perspective by measuring a variety of different phenotypic and genotypic and omic types of principles. I think I had, over the course of the year, in the 4 different analyses I had done, probably in excess of 100,000 data points. And so you start to assemble a fairly large data bank that is also time dependent. You're going to hear much more about this from Nathan Price, who was the director of this project, in a subsequent lecture. But we had information taken about our cognitive and neurological function, about our cardiovascular function, about our digestive function, about our respiratory function, lymphatic and immune system, insulin sensitivity, and our DNA analyzed through omics analysis. And the objective here in this Pioneer 100 was to develop a pilot project bit of information that would then be a proof of principle that this could become ultimately the start of the Framingham Project for the 21st century, not to look at disease risk, but look at wellness promotion. What are the characteristics that constitute a well population? Not a population at disease risk. We're all skirting around the edges of the darkness of fear that we might have a disease come in the dark of night, but rather the positive attribution of health and wellness as something that we, by knowing ourselves at a different level, can both aspire to and achieve because we're doing the right things to be compatible with our genes. That's a whole different mentality than, oh, I hope my number for an ApoE4 doesn't get pulled for Alzheimer's or heart disease. Even ApoE4 is not a deterministically hardwired characteristic to either of those diseases. Now we recognize that this is a characteristic, if you have the double E4, that makes these people very sensitive to toll-like receptor activation through saturated fat consumption and oxidative stress and inflammatory mediators. So if they modulate their diet and lifestyle significantly, the expression of ApoE4 into that inflammatory state is significantly reduced. So even that, what we consider the death gene, is really modifiable by the appropriate intervention. So with that in mind, then, we undertook the Pioneer 100 participation. As I said, each one of us were committed to following the program. We could be on our own plan. It was an N of 1 study. So each of us would take our information and we would act on it as we would then feel fit, both for our own need and our own level of compliance. So we were wearing biometric devices, blood pressures going to the cloud, body mass index and body composition going to the cloud, everyday fitness measurements going to the cloud, right? So we would know sleep patterns you get from your Fitbit. And all of that then could be encoded, and we could look at trends and correlate it with what was going on in our lives. So it was like an aha experience. Now people say, should I do gene testing? I mean, it seems a little early. Well, let me tell you, once you do gene testing, it opens your mind to a whole level of discovery of your relationship to yourself, because now you've intimately introduced yourself to your physiology. Now, let me say something about this. Before the cholesterol fingerstick test was developed by Boehringer Ingelheim, which was in the 70s and early 80s, very few people, less than 20% of the population, knew their blood cholesterol levels. And therefore, and I'm going to be a little sexist here because I think this is the way it actually went, a wife might be reading a woman's magazine about a heart disease and cholesterol. She would talk to her husband saying, do you know your cholesterol level? Because I just read this article saying high cholesterol is associated with heart disease. And he would say, I don't have a cholesterol problem. That's somebody else's problem. Because he'd never had his cholesterol measured, right? So out of sight, out of mind. Don't ask the question, don't get the answer. Then suddenly Boehringer Ingelheim brings out this fingerstick cholesterol test. Now where do you find it? Shopping malls, health fairs, everybody, and the wife now says, hey honey, over there you can get a free cholesterol check. Oh geez, okay, so you go over, put your finger down. Now it becomes your number of 270, right? Now no longer can it be somebody else's problem, now it's your problem. And what happened? Through that, coincidentally was born a new class of drugs called statins at the same time. So once you ask the question, the answer starts to resolve, and suddenly cardiology becomes preventive medicine, right? It transformed cardiology. The biggest selling drug in all of the pharmacopoeia for that period of time was a drug that didn't treat any disease. They're called statins. It was Lipitor. It didn't treat a disease. There's not a single diagnosis for high cholesterol. It's a marker for a disease risk, right? It changed the whole pattern of thinking of our society. That's what's happening when you wear these things. That's what's happening when you have your genes tested. It introduces you in an intimate way to the opportunity to engage in wellness in a way that you never have in the absence of that information. So what I learned from my genome analysis, there's a lot more, but I'm giving kind of the top line. I found I had vitamin D receptor polymorphisms with low binding. So, that might be interesting relative to the amount of vitamin D I require to get my level of 25-hydroxy up into a meaningful therapeutic level. I found I had a methylene tetrahydrofolate C677T slow folate metabolism polymorphism, Genomics. I found I had a catechol O-methyltransferase slow methylation. Now they're starting to stack up, right? I have a MTHFR and I have a COMT. And I have a GST type 1 null meaning I don't have that glutathione S-transferase form to help me detoxify stuff that might require methylation, which I already have a bad methylation opportunity to begin with. Now it starts to kind of tell a story, doesn't it? It tells a story. Then I found I had a COL1A1 polymorphism related to bone loss and collagen defects. I had a combination of FTO, APOA2, ADRB2, LPL, lipoprotein lipase, CTP, and ApoC3 saturated fatty acid sensitivity. All of these genes suggest my diet would not be best if it had a lot of palmitic and stearic acid in it, because it would drive more oxidative stress and inflammation. I had a couple of interesting drug pharmacogenomic uniquenesses. I had a polymorphism of VKORC1, which is a risk to taking warfarin. This is related to CYP2C9, and an IFNL3 polymorphism that's a risk to taking PEG interferon. So I'd want to be very cautious if I ever was in a situation where I was forced to take that as a medication. So it tells you a little bit about how you respond to medications. Then here is where the story gets very interesting, I believe. Some of the phenotypic serological biomarker data that ties into this. And I was fortunate, just like Michael Schneider, who had the flu during the course of his experience with his N of 1 analysis, I had, I guess, the fortune of a misfortune, because my dearly beloved mother, that I've already spoken to, had her first really major health crisis. She had a stroke. And fortunately, she's done actually quite well, considering. But I can tell you the first 6 to 8 weeks were not that enjoyable. I was spending most of my time at the hospital and working with the staff there. So that was just happened to be coincident when I took my first samples for the Pioneer 100 study, right? So it was like I had an imposed physiological and psychological stress, because I wasn't eating right, I wasn't exercising, I wasn't sleeping, I was under psychological stress. And so when I got the first data back, as is shown here, all of that looked very suggestive, right? So my serum insulin was, fasting insulin was whopping at 17.6. My hemoglobin A1C was not too elevated because it was probably, early on in this whole series, but my HOMA score, which is a measurement of insulin sensitivity, was elevated at 4.7. So I was in what one might call either pre-diabetes or early stage type 2 diabetes. My inflammatory markers were, in terms of HSCRP, was not high, but my IL-8 was very high. So I had a lot of kind of white cell stuff going on here, a lot of the body talking back, a lot of God of War, the color red, Mars, speaking to me, as it kind of reflected the conversations I was having with a few hospitalists in the hospital at the time. So I'm speaking to hospitalists that were managing my mother's care. It was very interesting, by the way, just as an aside, the nursing staff in the ICU were extraordinarily sensitive, and I had great conversations with them, and they understood this functional medicine concept just prima facie. The hospitalists, that was a whole different story. And I had some really interesting encounters with the hospitalists that ultimately led me to the chief of staff of the hospital, and we did make some changes. But but I think it was reflective in my red-colored IL-8 levels. So what about my blood element analysis? So this is, your nutritional elements, and again, the toxic metals, I had a very high level of mercury. Now, where did that mercury come from? I don't have a lot of amalgams, but I'm a Seattle, Washington guy. I'm a huge lover of Japanese food. We have sushi 3 or 4 nights a week. And I was a big ahi guy. We also do a lot of fishing in Hawaii, so I eat a lot of ahi. So I cut my tuna down, and it made a very dramatic effect over 6 months on my red cell mercury level, reducing it. I talked about my vitamin D level. There it is, 38, even though I was taking 5,000 IUs of vitamin D a day. But remember, I found out from my genomics, I had the vitamin D receptor polymorphism poor binder. So I upped my vitamin D. My level came up into the about 57 over the course of the next 3 months. My glutathione was good. Coenzyme Q10 was good. And then once again, we say, well, if I'm eating all this fish, I must have pretty good omega-3s, and I did. My omega-3 levels in my analysis were about 7.5%. You want to get it between 7 and 11% is kind of a great range to have your total omega-3 levels. So it did kind of track with my eating habits. Then, of course, we did the adrenal stress test on all these individuals, and it was very interesting over the course of the months, because we did this 4 different times, to watch the trend as my mother's status recovered. I got back into sleep and my rhythm, and you could watch my phenotype then normalizing around my adrenal stress. And then what about things called rest and relaxation and vacation? This was a very interesting illustration. So, your Fitbit obviously will give you a running record of your pulse rate. I've got the one that has the pulse monitor on it. So this is my resting heart rate for 30 days at a time that we decided to go for Hawaii for a week. Now you'll notice that my resting pulse started at 55, and over the course of the next week on vacation it went to 46. But then when I returned home, it went back up to 55. So this is another indicator, right? It's a learning curve. We're getting information and we're tying it together with our own uniqueness. What is stressful for one is not necessarily stressful for another. This is individualized. And we know that heartbeats that exceed 55 beats per minute, as you go up, your resting heartbeat goes up, there's an increasing increment of cardiovascular disease, right? So you'd like your heartbeat to be in the 50 to 55 range as a resting pulse. Well, what about my microbiome? Yes, we had 4 different opportunities to send off our stools with some reluctance to an anonymous testing lab. But it was very, very interesting because there's 2 features of your stool microbiome that we can tease out at present that are useful information. Number 1 is the diversity score of your species. If this is ecology that you've got down there in your lower 40, you'd like your ecology to be very like the rainforest with a lot of different plants that are maintaining stability. So you want a high diversity score. So this is my value, the green dot, in comparison to the other 103 people that were involved in the Pioneer 100. And you can see I had a pretty good total number of species. I was in the 80th percentile, and a pretty good diversity score. Now my diet tends to be more vegetable based. The only really animal protein I eat is fish with occasional chicken. So it's not totally unsurprising that I had a high diversity score, but I think it's interesting to note that when you laid this out onto the different families of bacteria, this is the Bacteroidetes, the Firmicutes, the proteobacteria, and the microbiota, which are different families that have different personalities. You'd like your green, which is the Firmicutes, and your red, which is the Bacteroides, to have a pretty good balance. Those that eat more vegetable-based diets generally have a preponderance of the red and a lower amount of the green. And that happens to be associated with lower incidences of certain types of digestive disorders and other metabolic disorders. So my number is right there in the middle. You can see that dark black line is where I ranked versus the other 102 people. Now you might say, how did that change over the course of the year? Because knowing this information, I became much more compliant thinking my microbiota. It's really interesting. So I said, oh, those probiotics in the morning, I can't miss them. Oh, those prebiotics, I need to eat more things with fructans and oligosaccharides in them. And I need to be more conscious about the, staying away from stuff just because it was convenient and I shouldn't really eat it. I just stay on my plan. And so using my microbiological diversity of my gut flora was really kind of a track back to compliance to the right diet. And by the way, you can change your microbiota in your stool within a period of days by changing your diet. It doesn't take months. So this is a fairly dynamic community relationship we have with our microbiota. So when I took all of this together, I say, where is this really going to be applied? And how does this really work in this complexity that we call our healthcare system? So I think you've already heard beautiful examples this morning as to where this is seeing its first emergence. First is this inborn errors of metabolism, genetic metabolism disorders, mitochondrial DNA mutations and mitochondrial transplants. You probably know that this is a new technology that's been approved in Britain, and it's now urgent to be improved, or at least it's imminent to be approved here in the United States, to actually replace mitochondria in fetuses or embryos that have altered mitochondrial genetic disorders that could end up to mitochondrial encephalopathies. So this is approved in Britain to do that kind of genetic transplant of mitochondria. Now, you might have some questions about that. I'm just saying this is what's going on based upon this information that's available from mitochondrial DNA analysis. Have you heard of CRISPR technology, CRISPR-Cas9 technology? This is just absolutely unbelievable. I was just at a meeting in Boston that I flew out from here talking about CRISPR-Cas9 technology. This is gene editing technology. I won't go into it in great detail. I'll just give you a quick insight that this technology, which was discovered in bacteria, is a technology that will allow what everyone has always wanted for having molecular scissors to go in and cut out one gene that's damaged and insert an appropriate gene. And the application of this over time, not today, will allow undoubtedly the ability to modulate genetic inborn errors of metabolism at the level of gene editing. Now, where that goes from there, this is the great world of the unknown, because now you might say, well, I'd like my boy to be 6'8", or I'd like my daughter to be able to jump high or do ballet, or so there's all sorts of ethical and interesting questions that come out of this, but that technology is a frame shift, translational, disruptive innovation that is creating right now this next stage of how we see our genes and how we modify our genes. We then talk about targeted cancer therapy. And you heard a beautiful report, and you'll hear more over the course of the next couple of days about tumor genomics, the HER2 mutations, and the development of a drug like Herceptin that will work on a specific genetic mutant, these kinase mutational injuries that are associated with specific forms of cancer. And that we now don't get cancer, we get specific gene modulations that induce then a oncological event that we later call cancer. So the concept of cancer is really cancer is individualized to the patient. It's this N of one experience in real time. And so we're seeing all sorts of interesting ways of modulating these specific unique forms of cancer in individuals who have these mutational alterations. And then, of course, the big, great unknown, where the biggest impact of this technology is going to play a role, is that of personalized lifestyle healthcare, in which you start implementing not just the treatment of genetically damaged genes that are associated with the disease, but you start understanding the genome in such a way as you can implement a wellness program, which is the focus of the Pioneer 100 and other projects, to try to understand how we employ and leverage this information into the new wellness economy, the economy that's going to transform health and reduce this burden of disease so that the next drug is not just another symptom-suppressing medication that doesn't treat the cause, but rather manages the effect. So this personalized cancer care, genomics is the future of cancer care, is finally here. In fact, I heard a presentation yesterday by the head of oncology at Harvard Med School, who was saying that melanoma, which used to be considered really almost a diagnosis of death, will go to a zero level of death over the next few years with the technology that's now available. As long as we can get the right diagnosis early on, the drugs that are available will treat it like a chronic illness, like you would diabetes or heart disease. And that these breakthroughs in understanding how to leverage this genomic technology into targeted, personalized precision medicine is really starting to happen. And this example in Time magazine of these two women with the same diagnosis of glioblastoma, one in North Dakota, they didn't have access to the kind of drugs that were being tested versus the other woman who was in the metropolitan Boston area who had access to being a trial subject with some of these new medications, and their outcome based upon their ability to have access to drugs specific to their tumor is quite a dramatic story of where we're heading in this whole area. So we are in the functional medicine revolution. Omics and functional medicine as the system of application is exactly a marriage made in heaven. We are harnessing the omics revolution, and it requires a systems biology operating system. Functional medicine is the systems biology operating system for all the omics-related technologies. We know, as Dr. Hood and his colleagues, Nathan Price and others at the Institute for Systems Biology have told us, we need these 4 Ps to be fulfilled, but we need a system in which we can apply the 4 Ps. That is the functional medicine operating system, the way that we accumulate this information leading to actionable intervention with the patient. So on the horizon, I would say the following. Medicine based upon application of omics to a systems biology approach to disease prevention and treatment is at hand. It's not way off in the scientific future. It is at hand today. You're learning about that, you're leveraging, and you will become leaders. The information you will get here will, in fact, arm you with information, and I assure you that 95% of practicing healthcare providers don't understand today. You will be at the first at the gate to assist in this transformation. Number 2, quantification and wellness will become the new growth industry in healthcare. Why do you think you have Google and Apple and all these other players that are not healthcare companies involved? Because they know that's where the next big revolution in industry is going to occur. It will be like the birthing of the microcomputer industry in the 80s. Third, biometric data collected and analyzed will occur automatically through devices. I had the chance to wear the Google contact lens where I was measuring by my tears in real time my blood sugar. Yeah, a lens that actually has a piezoelectric device that picks up in your tears glucose that is correlated with an algorithm to your blood sugar, in which you measure in real time. Now think of what happened if people had non-invasively had access to their blood sugar levels throughout the day. So every time they had eaten something or done something or had a stressful life, they could look down at their Apple Watch and they would say, oh my word, my blood sugar is now 160. What's going on here? Or 220. So I think information is power. And in fact, one of the members of my board is Dr. Dennis Ossuello, who is a former chief of staff at Harvard Med School and at Mass General Hospital. And he was the principal person developing the app for the Apple Watch for this measurement of aspects related to blood sugar and aspects related to pulse and other fitness-related things that the Apple Watch is going to do. That Apple Watch data, he feels, will assemble over the course of the next 3 years more information about lifestyle and diabetes and blood sugar than all studies that have ever been done in the history of science. That's how this is happening in real time, consumer-driven information accrual that's taking the patient into the front and putting the provider as the service-related individual. Next, people become activated through information, as I said, and that will then allow them to understand how their lives affect their gene expression. Organ-specific immunological assessment will be done that allows for personalized therapy, because we know the immune system and the nervous system are directly interrelated with our environment and how they function. And lastly, the pharmaceutical industry is going to be taking a major change. I would suggest that maybe the big 6 pharmaceutical companies are all running scared right now, because the next companies that will grow up may not even be pharmaceutical companies that take over their space. Pharmaceutical industry develops drugs that modulate genetic expression and network biology rather than just agents that inhibit downstream pathological processes. That's the future of where we're heading. So with that in mind, can we make the future happen today? And I think the answer is yes. Your presence here is the start of that future. We need a well-informed cadre of informationally intact individuals who are mission-driven, passionate, and resist authority to create this paradigm shift. You are that group. We need to encourage people to start getting on board and measuring what's going on in their daily lives, because information is power. We need that information to get up into the cloud and be able to be looked at anonymously, patient anonymously, so that we can start developing patterns because in numbers become statistical observations that you can't find in small numbers. Informatics will become part of our daily living, this big data concept making, and you're going to hear more of this from Dr. Price, and social media will become the driver, just like patients like me, in which people are starting to communicate around the globe about affinity areas of concern. Health is the big issue, and wellness is the top of the drawer in the food chain of information right now. So let me close by saying that, as Lori indicated in her introduction, we're moving into an extraordinary period where all of this information needs to be digested, codified, distilled down, and distributed in ways that can be manageable. The IFM Omics series is a commitment to do that starting right now. This is the first day of starting this Omics imperative. It'll go on through December with things that we'll be seeing, articles and communication and news-to-use devices that will coming out on your smart devices. In the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute, we have an online educational portal that has free of charge the downloads of all of our videos that we've done with these opinion leaders, the people whose names I've talked about that have had the privilege of interviewing at these different meetings. So you just need to go to our plmi.org website and you can just sign in and get access to watch the videos of these thought leaders. And we have a 2015 consortium I'd invite all of you to that's going to have as our lead presenter, I'm very proud to say, Siddhartha Mukherjee, who was the Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Emperor of All Maladies, well-known oncologist who did what I think is a tour de force job in a book that's moving on every level, and also the PBS special of the same name that you might have seen. So he will be one of our lead-off speakers. We've got quite an assembly of what I consider thought leaders that I have brought from multiple different disciplines on this point of convergence where we are all participants and active players in this revolution that's occurring today. And the operating system for it happens to be functional medicine. Thank you very much.